Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Western Heritage Center. I'm Kevin Koiser, the Executive Director, and we're thrilled. We didn't know if one person or two people would be here. We're thrilled to see so many folks come out. This is our first public program in over a year. And we're still taking cautionary steps through the end of May by requiring masks in the building. We do have another program next week that you might be interested. We have Molly Krugenberg coming in. She's the new Executive Director of the Montana Historical Society, the first woman director of the Montana Historical Society. I always like to brag about the Western Heritage Center because we listed the last 4 directors before I became director, and it was all women going back 30 plus years. So we were way ahead of the curve. Anyway, so Molly will be here next week to introduce herself, but also to update you on the status of the new Montana Historical Center, the Montana Heritage Center up in Helena, which is in the process of being created and built right now. So that'll be fantastic. If you haven't had a chance, one of the things we're excited about Stephanie Alton being here is here's a film that's kind of focused on the Big Timber area and ranching. And we have probably, I don't know, she's Big Timber's most famous resident, Barbara Van Cleve. Cecilia and staff have been working with Barbara to bring her photography from the Big Timber area also. And I met Barbara about 2 years ago, and she was on Good Morning America last year. And we're really excited that she's really almost created this new show for the Western Heritage Center, that it'll be able to go out and be seen in other places. Our Hoof with a Historian program has been kicked up again. We're still limiting to 10 people. 10 people. Cecilia, I believe, is doing the program tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and she's doing the Then and Now Picturing Billings, which is the Depot neighborhood. So Cecilia, if you haven't been on that tour, it's fantastic. The tour begins at the Billings Depot at 2310 Montana Avenue. Without further ado, anybody in staff have any comments? No comments. Everybody's very quiet. It's hard to tell if they're talking or not. But, anyway, we have Stephanie Alton today, who is going to discuss her film, Ridin for the Brand. Stephanie received her BFA at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington, an MFA in photography from Pratt Institute, Brooklyn, and completed further education at New York University. Her photography and film work has been shown at numerous festivals and venues. Riding for the Brand received national exposure through PBS and showcases Alton's wide range of technical skills as she served as director, producer, cinematographer, researcher, editor, sound editor, and such, and for the production. We are very excited. She uses a mix of history, myth, family lore, and artistic expression. She provides an in-depth look at an important Montana story, and we're looking forward to hearing from Stephanie. And appreciate her coming in from Bozeman today, so thank you. We both are vaccinated, right?
Right.
Okay, good. And then here she is.
Okay.
And I can help you with that.
Okay, thanks. Can everyone hear me all right? I don't know. Is that all right? Yeah? Okay. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, the Western Heritage Center, for having me today. My name's Stephanie Alton, and I did Riding for the Brand. I'm the filmmaker on it. It's around an hour documentary. And I planned on doing it over a year, and being an independent filmmaker, it's always a struggle to get the money for it. So it ended up being 9 years, like a decade of my life, to get this done. But it ended up working out because the story unfolded. A lot was happening during those 9 years as far as ranching. The first year I was shooting, BSE broke out, mad cow disease, so the borders closed, and people started asking where their beef came from. And so the industry started changing and working with the public and trying to figure out what they were going to do from there. And also encroachment and the government buying up grazing permits. So How did I get onto this story? Let's see if I can figure out this. Okay. My mother would always read me stories when I'd go to bed at night about the West, about cowboys and Indians. And it was just a fantasy to always go out there. So my mom would take me out on vacations to Colorado. And then I ended up going to school in New York City for film and photography. And after 9 years, I couldn't handle the city life and all the people. And my grandfather would always tell me about Alaska. So he went up there during the World War II to build the barracks for the military up there. It took him 6 weeks, him and his friends, to get up there because they had to build bridges over the rivers and roads around roads because of the mud. And so that was always a thing that he always wanted to do again. He'd tell me all about it. So then I decided to go to Alaska. And while I was in Alaska, I worked in film and photography. And I met this guy, Ira. He was from Big Timber, Montana. And he was a good storyteller. He told me all about cowboying on the ranches in Montana. So I decided to come down to Montana and see for myself what it was like. So I moved to Big Timber, and I got a job bartending. It was a great way to network in Big Timber because everyone sort of filtered through the bar, and I'd ask questions about who would be willing for me to follow them around on their ranch and, you know, sort of become part of the ranch and go with their chores, and they'd have me over for dinner and everything, so I sort of became part of the family. So it was a great experience.
Which bar?
I worked at the Mad Hatter. That's no longer around. And I worked at the Timber Bar and the Grand, so I got to meet all the different people. So one of the ranchers I was interviewing was Melody White out of Two Dot, and she had the White Ranch. And I was like, what did it take, you know, a family to come to the Montana Territories, you know, back in the 1860s? What kind of person could make it out here? And she said they had to be tougher than hammered owl manure. And I thought that was such a unique saying that it became my working title for my film as I was working on the documentary. And here's a clip of her saying,
they had to be tougher than hammered owl manure. The cattle had to be tough, the livestock itself. So ranching in Montana is pretty young at the time of the cattle drives, and people bringing cattle drives up into the southeastern corner of the state was about when ranching really started in eastern Montana. Not to say that there weren't people here that were trying, it's just that there weren't many white people here who could survive by themselves.
This one is of the XIT, and my great-grandfather and his sons worked for XIT, who brought cattle up from Texas to Montana, to Miles City in the Glendive area. They would, you know, trail the cows around, and they talked about the old cook wagons and the brandings, and just making money so they could put their own operations together.
What did they mean by open range? I was never sure. What I discovered was that the government set aside land between the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers. This area is larger than the state of New Jersey and was located between two Indian reservations in central Montana. It was allocated as public land for grazing. I guess the government wanted to give the little guy an opportunity to compete against the corporations. It only took 3 years until there were no buffalo and 600,000 head of cattle and nearly 1 million sheep.
At that time, they had to have a regular roundup, and the crew would go out and brand the cattle wherever they found them. And then whatever brand the mother cow carried, that was what was put on the calf. And of course, a lot of people later on came in, and so there were mixed herds many different brands, and then they had to have a rep or a representative from each ranch that ran cattle on the open range. When they opened this country up for homesteading, people came from all over the world. Came through by the Statue of Liberty and came into the New York harbor there, and then they scattered, and they could get free land, something they'd never had before in their life, and it was a new beginning for so many of them. When they started homesteading, the homesteaders had to fence their 160 acres, and that broke up the open range, so there was no more open range grazing.
Montana looked green and lush and had lots of tall, dead old grass and new grass coming up, so they thought they were running into paradise, into fertile land. Well, then typical Montana, harsh winters, droughty springs and summers, those people went broke and they left.
A lot of the homesteaders and such as that, they'd pull up stakes and leave. They'd leave their milk cows, draft horses, and everything else. Needless to say, why the country was overrun with horses. Grandfather, he'd trail them and ride them from Miles City up, and by the time he got back up home, he'd have some broke saddle horses to sell. Got a stake ahead and went and bought some ground and made a place. This ground in Montana isn't like ground in the central United States and such as that. It's pretty hard ground, pretty tough country.
The people came out here with absolutely nothing other than just the will to survive, and they've done it. They've done it well.
Initiative is what it took to survive back then.
Hard work and diligence.
Okay, so after being around these ranchers, they would always say they'd get frustrated with the city folk because they didn't know where their beef came from and what it took for them to get their beef to their plates. So I decided to go out to New York City and interview people on what they knew about the West and if they knew anything about ranching. So here is another clip.
You know, there's a lot of people in a lot of towns that are very well educated that think that meat comes from the back of a grocery store. They don't know, and they don't care to know as long as it's there.
I think a lot of them still to some degree think there's cowboys and Indians running around here playing their war games and everything.
So I decided to go to New York City and find out if what these ranchers were saying about the city folk was true. What do you think a ranch is like in Montana?
Think about cowboys and Indians.
You are live in Times Square, New York City, crossroads of the world.
I know when I go to the supermarket and, gee, I want a steak, I just go and I buy it. And you don't think about where it came from, what someone had to do to get that.
What do you think a cowboy does for a living?
I think so. They are rich guys, you know. They got a lot of money with them. That's why they treat themselves horse, and wherever they go, they live the good, you know, good hotels, motels, whatever, you know. They eat good, they drink good, you know.
I'm not really sure what a cowboy does. My only reference of cowboys are from movies and television.
I think everyone dreams about being a cowboy. I like the West. I wish I was riding around on the horse herding the cattle all day, getting paid for it.
So yeah, that's their idea of the West. So I thought I needed to do a film and show them what really goes on in a ranch. So I decided to pick you know, showing them the life cycle of a calf and a lamb and see what it takes to do that. So here's another clip. And also, like my grandfathers and my grandparents' generation, everyone was close to agriculture. It's either you're on the farm or someone in the family's in the farm. But my generation, a lot of people haven't even been on a farm, so I thought it'd be good to do something where I could show them what takes place.
While calving is in full swing, the sheep shearing begins. But due to the shortage of sheep shearers in the country, the work has been delayed for over a month.
We shear in usually in the middle of March and get ready for lambing then. And we lamb in April.
Big Timber was the region's largest wool producer, supplying wool for military uniforms for both world wars. After the shearing is done, it's lambing time.
And usually during lambing time, we have our daughter comes with her family, and she's done that several years in a row and spends almost the whole month helping us out and our grandchildren.
She's 34.
Lawrence is painting numbers on every lamb and mother to keep track of each pair.
This is for sore mouth, and this is for overeating and tetanus and influenza.
We dock our lamb's tails, cut the tails off and cut their nuts off, put a rubber band on their nuts. At the docking, you take the tail off so it doesn't get full of burrs and just a bunch of stuff like that. Just it gets dirty with the tail.
After the long winter, everyone looks forward to springtime in Montana. This is when ranching communities come together to brand all the newborn calves. Every rancher is proud of their brand.
Get a wrestling crew. Takes two to wrestle a calf. Get several teams of that, and then get a couple ropers in there, and people running irons, and people giving shots and tags, and
Then the bull calves are castrated to become steers.
everybody's got a job at a branding.
Even if that job means eating freshly cut calf testicles.
Oh my God! We're having scalloped potatoes and pork loin and tossed salad and pumpkin pie cake and red velvet cake. If you want to have your ropers and your wrestlers come back, you need to feed them really well so they want to come back. Otherwise, you don't get the crew when you need them. Back in the olden days, women were not allowed to do hard physical labor. They were expected to be the housekeepers clean and cook and take care of the garden and the kids. And they were not expected or allowed to know hard physical labor. It was probably in the late 60s when the women's movement started to have some legs that women demanded to go and learn how to do these things. Up until then, they were considered bad luck. And it didn't matter if it was at a branding or a racetrack, women were just considered bad luck, primarily because they didn't know anything, they were not taught. So in about the late 60s was when women got to be able to get out of the kitchen and go have some fun outside and drink some beer.
I jumped out of the pickup to get on the back to start feeding Cake. He hit the locks on the door. Locked himself out of the pickup.
Which was driving.
Which was driving, but he always kept a spare pair wired up underneath the grill.
Usually after the branding's over, we crack the beers and the bullshit begins and the drinking begins.
Now you guys got to realize this horse here, she's stump broke. She will do anything.
Holding them? Holding them?
Hold them, hold me.
I'll raise you. You son of a... Both of you. You're c***ers.
Oh, that's going to run me out of money.
You raise me?
Yeah, I raised you 50.
Your bet.
I'm out.
I'm out.
I don't know how these guys do it. After a long day of branding and an all-night poker game, it's time to work early the next morning and they're actually up to it.
Working with livestock is a constant danger, and you try and work the best way you can with them with the least amount of danger to both. There's constant dangers always, but you can't go through everything with the idea that, well, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to get hurt. You can't have that attitude, because if you did, you'd never get nothing done. Well, always consider yourself fortunate when you can take your own boots off at night.
So also the jobs on a ranch, it's a lot of people wouldn't know unless you're on the ranch. You have to also be able to cut the hay, grow the hay, stack it. You're also a vet. You have to be a mechanic. You can't be calling a mechanic every time they have a tractor breakdown or something. And you also need to be a businessman. Oop. So there's a lot entailed in being a rancher that people would have no idea about. Also, one of the greatest events in the summertime for a western town is a rodeo. And so in Big Timber, especially during the 40s and the 50s, it was a huge event. And Leo Kramer, he became a stock rodeo producer, and it was because of these guys that over in Livingston, they needed some more bucking horses for their rodeo, and they heard that Leo Kramer had a bunch of draft horses, so they went over there and they picked out some draft horses, and they ended up ending bucking out well. So then Leo decided to get into the rodeo business. And I have some footage of, he had Gene Autry come in, and Gene Autry ended up buying the rodeo from him. So Gene Autry would sing and he'd ride his horse around, and Spud Kramer, that's in the film, was telling me that there'd be a mile-long bar down the middle of Main Street. So it's still a big event, but it was huge during that era. And then also, in the summertime in Big Timber, the Alstead Ranch had sheep coming through the middle of Big Timber. They had 3 bands of sheep, and they'd go 150 miles from their ranch up to the Absaroka Mountains, north of Yellowstone. And they've been doing that since the turn of the century, and they used to have 30 bands during the turn of the century going through town, which would be 30,000 sheep. And you see old pictures of the Absaroka Mountains, and there weren't many trees because of the fires and the sheep grazing it all the time. So yeah, things have changed. So the Alsteds had the last wilderness permit in the state of Montana. While I was filming that summer, the Alsteds had their sheep up in the wilderness and a fire broke out. And then so they could not go back through Big Timber, so they had to go through a different route, and they went to Gardner. And Gardner had never seen livestock go through town, and word got out, and so they had a big parade formed in Gardner. Like, people are lined up along the streets, and they're all eating their popcorn and drinking, and then the cowboys were bringing the sheep through town, and someone put in the newspaper that they needed help getting their sheep back to Big Timber. So people showed up with their horse trailers and semi-trailers and were able to get their sheep back there. It was a huge community event. It was pretty cool to watch. And then here I have the ranchers are always up against new things, and in this clip I show how Dwayne talks about the encroachment of people coming into Big Timber, and Elaine Alsted's talking about how the government's buying up grazing permits and how things are changing.
With the drought conditions and more city people moving into the area, it's been hard on the Mother's Head Ranch. Their new neighbors are not leasing the land back, making it near impossible for the ranch to stay financially viable.
It kind of puts you in a dilemma, having the one unit by itself, which couldn't run enough cattle to sustain our business. Why we thought that it would be in our best interest to sell that and try and put the money towards a unit that would.
With people moving into the scenic areas around Yellowstone Park, the Alsted Ranch is also coming up against a struggle for land use.
We leave Big Timber with our sheep usually around the 1st of July to the middle of July to hit the grazing right at the right timing. And then we hit the higher elevations later in the summer when it's hotter. We are the last one to run sheep in the wilderness area in Montana. There's several other different forest permits, but we're the last one to run actually in a wilderness.
The federal government is trying to buy out grazing permits from ranches like the Alsteds in order to remove livestock from wilderness and wildlife lands.
So Dwayne's motto was, "There's nothing more constant than change." And so while I was filming these 9 years, the Alsteds ended up selling off the ranch and buying a ranch up in Opheim, which is in northeast Montana on the border of Canada. And they sold their ranch in Big Timber to a family back east as a vacation home, and they just leased the land back to ranchers around them. And then Dwayne here, he had to buy another part of the ranch up in Geraldine, Montana, so they could run enough cattle to survive. And then I also have, you haven't seen him in any of the clips here, but there's Johnny Hoyland. He's a bachelor that still ranches at 95 years old out of the West Boulder in Big Timber. And he's up next to Tom Brokaw. Tom Brokaw has been trying to buy his place, and he will never sell it to him. And then Brooke Shields tried to buy it from him. She baked him a pie, an apple pie, and gave him a blank check, and she's like, "Fill out how much you want for your ranch. I want your ranch." So she came back a week later, and he gave her back the pie tin and the blank check, and he's like, "I'm not gonna sell this place." So he's like one of the last holdouts. He loves it. And then what happened to Dwayne is sort of sad. He was killed in an automobile accident, and so his mother ended up taking the ranch and leasing land back to the ranchers around the ranch. So I forgot to tell you that how I raised the money for this film was through a thing called Kickstarter. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. So that's how I raised enough money for my post-production. And I raised $20,000 with the help of the town of Big Timber. We had a showing and I showed part of the film, and they really helped out. And I was able to hire an editor to help me edit this, because I was editing it, and you get stuck on the scenes that, you know, you think are beautiful, but then someone else will see your film and they're like, that doesn't even, you know, go with your film. So you need someone else to look at it and cut it for you also. Then also I got my soundtrack done by Ben and Andy Bullington. I was really lucky to get them because it's a great soundtrack. And then my friend said, well, you're gonna have to tell the story since it's your story, so you're gonna have to narrate it. And I never narrated anything before. And so I got a narration coach for this. And it was all right. I don't think I'm the best narrator, but but anyway, I tried it. And anyway, Warren Miller, I don't know if you know Warren Miller. I ended up working for Warren Miller, so so he could relate to my narration problems. But yeah, yep. But I'm also working on a short film right now. It's about done right now, and let's see. Do I have? Wait. I thought I had a. I'm sorry. Oh my gosh! Oh, I'm going backwards. Oh, there. Okay, so that's my current project. Pete, I have both worlds. It's on an Eskimo rapper. He's from Tooksuk Bay, Alaska. I used to live up in Alaska, and I had a Yupik Eskimo roommate. And I'd always wanted to do a story in Tooksuk Bay. She would show me pictures of her village, and they would have pictures of the women with grass, weaving the grass in between the herring mouths. So you have a string of herring, and then you drape it around teepee poles. And I thought that was really cool. So I went during herring season to film this, but I'd seen some YouTube video footage of this rapper, and I was able to get a hold of him, and he wanted to do a film with me on his singing. And he wants to share the stories that he learned from his elders, the do's and don'ts, and pass it down to the younger generation, but in his way, which is through rapping and beatboxing. So I was just going to show you the trailer to show you what I'm doing now. And
the songs that we have today, they're stories, all kinds of stories, and the singers, they're sharing the story through song, they're singing, and the dancers, they're sharing it through motion with their body and how they move. A lot of the messages that I want them to hear came from our elders and their elders before them. It's been passed down vocally for thousands of years.
Whenever he's traveling, people want to say, I know you. Could I have your photo taken with you? Byron Nikolai is like a superstar.
Okay. So are there any questions or?
It was really interesting. I wondered what was the, like two questions. One is when you presented it to your Big Timber audience, how did you feel? And then how did the audience respond to your film?
I think Well, I was really nervous because I didn't know what they would think, you know, after they're being filmed, but they really don't know how I'm gonna edit it together or anything. But once they saw it, they really liked it, and they wanted to help me out and get it finished. So, yeah, they sort of all pulled together.
How long were you in Big Timber? How long did you stay there?
7 years.
Wow.
I know, yeah. My year-long project ended up a little longer. But yeah, so I got to know the community. It was a really great experience. I think they wanted to share their, you know, they know it's a unique community, so they wanted to share with me and have other people see what, you know, what it is like to have their lifestyle and what it takes to be a rancher.
Why did you pick Big Timber instead of?
Well, because Ira, the guy I met up in Alaska, he was from Big Timber, and that's how I sort of ended in Big Timber. Yeah. And it's beautiful there. Yeah. And the people were really nice when I first went there, so I decided to stay there. Yeah. And any other questions or?
And did you bring copies of your film?
Oh, yes, I have. If you're interested in the DVD of Ridin' for the Brand, I have it here. They're $17.99. So, yeah. I got a quote from Jim Harrison I was really excited about. It said, "Loved your movie. It's the best film I've ever seen on the West, which in terms of ranchers and cowboys is the same as it ever was. The film is utterly genuine." I was so lucky to get that quote. But anyway.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for coming and thank you for having me.